Isn't it great though? It's just a nice vibe. It's just a nice time tonight. That's it. Nothing special. No video games. We don't need to game all the time, you know? Sometimes we just want to sit back, relax, and enjoy a little less time. You're weird too? Let's be weird together. You know? More weird the better. The book I will be reading today is called The Wish. It is a really nice book. I never got a chance to read it. I did read it a few times, but like I just got stopped so many times with distractions. So I really want to get through this book. It's not too long. I'd say it's like maybe 400 pages, just about. That's a fantastic song. All right, we're reading The Wish, a book I'm gonna read. That's it. That's all this is. I'll check back in every couple of minutes, but I'm just gonna read and we'll go by like chapters to see what's up with people. This is the first chapter. It's called 'Tis the Season, December 2019. Whenever December rolled around, Manhattan transformed itself into a city that Maggie didn't always recognize. Tourists thronged the shows on Broadway and flooded the sidewalks outside department stores in Midtown. Actually, I might turn the music down just a little bit. Alright, boutiques and restaurants overflowed with shoppers, clutching bags, Christmas music filtered from hidden speakers, and hotel lobbies sparkled from decorations. The Rockefeller Center Christmas tree was lit by multicolored bulbs and the flashes of thousands of iPhones, and cross-town traffic, never speedy in the best of times, became so jammed up that it was so often quicker to watch than to take a cab. But walking had its own challenges. Frigid wind frequently whipped between the buildings, necessitating thermal underwear, plentiful fleece, and jackets zipped to the collars. Maggie Dawes, who considered herself a free spirit, consumed by wanderlust, had always loved the idea of New York Christmas, albeit in a look-how-pretty postcard kind of way. In reality, like a lot of New Yorkers, she did her best to avoid Midtown during the holidays. Instead, she either stayed close to her home in Chelsea or, more commonly, fled to warmer climes. As a travel photographer, she sometimes thought of herself less as a New Yorker and more as a nomad who happened to have a permanent address in the city. In a notebook she kept in the drawer of her nightstand, she'd compiled a list of more than 100 places she still wanted to visit. Some of them so obscure or remote that even reaching them would be a challenge. Since dropping out of college 20 years ago, she'd been adding to the list, noting places that sparked her imagination for one reason or another, even as her travels enabled her to cross out the other destinations. With a camera slung over her shoulder, she'd visited every continent, more than 82 countries and 43 of the 50 states. She'd taken tens of thousands of photographs, from images of wildlife in the Okavango Delta in Botswana to shots of the aurora borealis in Lapland. There were photographs taken as she'd hiked in the ice trails, others from Skeleton Coast in Namibia, still more among the ruins of Timbuktu. 12 years ago, she'd learned to scuba dive and had spent 10 days documenting marine life in Raja Ampat. 4 years ago, she'd hiked to the infamous Pero Taksang, or Tiger's Nest, a Buddhist monastery built with a cliffside in Bhutan with a panoramic views of the Himalayas. Others had often marveled at her adventures, but she learned that adventure is a word with many connotations, not all of them good. Case in point was the adventure she was on now. That's how she sometimes described it to her Instagram followers and YouTube subscribers. Funny. That one that kept her largely confined to either her gallery or small 2-bedroom apartment on West 19th Street, instead of venturing to the more exotic locales. The same adventure that led occasional thoughts of suicide. Oh, she'd never actually do it. The thought of it terrified her, and she'd admit it as much in one of the many videos she created for YouTube. For almost 10 years, her videos had been rather ordinary as far as photographers' posts went. She described her decision-making process when taking pictures, offered numerous Photoshop tutorials, and reviewed new cameras and their many accessories, usually posting 2 to 3 times a month. Those YouTube videos, in addition to her Instagram posts and Facebook pages and the blog on her website, had always been popular with photography geeks while also burnishing her professional reputation. 3.5 years ago, however, on a whim, she posted a video to her YouTube channel about her recent diagnosis, one that had nothing to do with photography. The video, a rambling, unfiltered description of the fear and uncertainty she suddenly felt when she learned she had stage 4 melanoma, probably shouldn't have been posted at all. But what she imagined would be a lonely voice echoing back at her from the empty reaches of the internet somehow managed to catch the attentions of others. She wasn't sure why or how, but that video, of all the ones she'd ever posted, had attracted a trickle, then a steady stream, and finally deluge of views, comments, questions, and upvotes from people who had never heard of her or her work as a photographer. Feeling as though she had to respond to those who'd been moved by her plight, she'd posted another video regarding her diagnosis that became even more popular. Since then, about once a month, she'd continue to post videos in the same vein, mainly because she had no other choice but to continue. In the past 3 years, she did discuss the various treatments and how they'd make her feel, sometimes even displaying the scars from her surgery. She talked about radiation burns and nausea and hair loss, and wandered openly about the meaning of life. She mused about her fear of dying and speculated on the possibility of an afterlife. There were issues, but maybe to starve off her own depression when discussing such a miserable subject. She did her best to keep the videos as light in tone as possible too. She supposed that was part of the reason for her popularity, but who really knew? The only certainty was that somehow, almost reluctantly, she'd become the star of her own reality web series, one that had begun with hope but slowly narrowed to focus on a single, inevitable ending. And perhaps unsurprisingly, as the grand finale approached, her viewership exploded even more. In her first cancer video, that's how she mentally referred to them, as opposed to her real videos. She stared into the camera with a wary grin and said, "Right off the bat, I hated it. Then it started growing on me." God damn it. I shouldn't be laughing at that. She knew it was probably a poor taste joke about her illness, but the whole thing struck her as absurd. Why her? At the time, she was 36 years old, she exercised regularly, and she followed a reasonably healthy diet. There was no history of cancer in her family. She'd grown up in a cloudy Seattle and lived in Manhattan, which ruled out any history of sunbathing. She'd never visited a tanning salon. None of it made any sense. But that was the point about cancer, wasn't it? Cancer didn't discriminate. It just happened to be unlucky. And after a while, she'd finally accepted that the better question was really, why not her? She wasn't special. To that point in her life, there'd been times where she considered herself interesting or intelligent or even pretty, but the word special had never entered her mind. When she'd received her diagnosis, she would have sworn she was in perfect health. A month earlier, she visited Vadhu Island and in the Maldives on a photo shoot for Condé Nast. She traveled there hoping to capture bioluminescence just offshore that made ocean waves glow like starlight as it lit from within. Sea plankton was reasonable for the spectacular light, and she allotted extra time to shoot some images for personal use, perhaps for even eventual sale in her gallery. She was scouting a mostly empty beach near her hotel in mid-afternoon with a camera in hand, trying to envision the shot she aimed to take once evening descended. She wanted to capture a hint of the shoreline, with perhaps a boulder in the foreground, the sky, and, of course, the waves just as they were cresting. She spent more than an hour taking different shots from different angles in various locations on the beach when a couple strolled past her, holding hands. Lost in her work, she barely registered their presence. A few moments later, while scanning the line where the waves were breaking offshore through her viewfinder, she heard the woman's voice behind her. She spoke English, but with a distinctly German accent. "Excuse me, miss," the woman said. "I can see you're busy and I'm sorry to bother you." Maggie lowered her camera. "Yes?" "It's a little difficult to say this, but have you had a dark spot on the back of your shoulder examined?" Maggie frowned, trying without success to see the spot between the straps of her bathing suit that the woman was referring to. "I didn't know. I didn't know I had a dark spot there." She squinted at the woman in confusion. "And why are you so interested?" The woman, 50-ish, with short gray hair, nodded. "I should perhaps introduce myself. I'm Dr. Sabine Kessel," she said. "I'm a dermatologist in Munich. The spots look abnormal." Maggie blinked. "You mean like cancer?" "I don't know," the woman said, her expression cautious. "But if I were you, I would examine it as soon as possible. It could be nothing, of course. Or it could be serious. Dr. Kestel didn't have to say that. Though it took 5 nights to achieve what she wanted from the shoot, Maggie was pleased with the raw files. She would work on them extensively on digital post-production. The real art and photography these days almost always emerged in post, but she already knew the results would be spectacular. In the meantime, and though she tried not to worry about it, she also made an appointment with Dr. Schnall Khatri, a dermatologist on the Upper East Side 4 days after her return to the city. The spot was biopsied in early July 2016, and afterwards, she was sent for additional testing. She had an MRI and a PET scan done at the Memorial Sloan Kettering Hospital later that same month. After the results had come in, Dr. Khatri sat her down in the examination room, where he quietly and seriously informed her that she had stage 4 melanoma. Later that day, she was introduced to an oncologist named Leslie Brodigan, who would oversee her care. In the aftermath of these meetings, Maggie did her own research on the internet. Though Dr. Brodigan did tell her that the general statistics meant very little when it came to predicting outcomes for a particular individual, Maggie couldn't help fixating on the numbers. The survival rate after 5 years for those diagnosed with stage 4 melanoma she learned was less than 50%. In stunned disbelief, Maggie made her first cancer video the following day. At her second appointment, Dr. Brodigan, a vibrant, blue-eyed blonde who seemed to personify the term good health, explained everything about her condition again, since the whole process had been so overwhelming that Maggie could remember only bits and pieces of the first meeting. Essentially, having stage 4 melanoma meant that cancer had metastasized not only to distant lymph nodes, but to some of her other organs as well. In her case, both her liver and her stomach. The MRI and the PET scans had found that cancerous growths invading healthier parts of her body like an army of ants devouring food laid out on a picnic table. Long story short, the next 3.5 years were a blur of treatment and recovery, with occasional flashes of hope illuminating dark tunnels of anxiety. She had surgery to remove the infected lymph nodes and the metastases in her liver and stomach. The surgery was followed by radiation, which was excruciating, turning her skin black in places and leaving behind nasty scars to go with the ones she'd collected in the operating room. She also learned there were different kinds of melanoma, even for those with stage 4, which led to different treatment options. In her case, that meant immunotherapy, which seemed to work for a couple of years until it finally didn't. Then, last April, she had begun chemotherapy and continued it for months, hating how it made her feel but convinced that it had to be effective. How could it not work? She wondered. It seemed like it'd be killing every part of her. These days, she barely recognized herself in the mirror. Food nearly always tasted too bitter or too salty, which made it hard to eat, and she dropped more than 20 pounds from already petite frame. Her oval-shaped brown eyes now appeared sunken and oversized above her protruding cheekbones. Her face more like skin stretched over a skull. She was always cold and wore thick sweaters even in an overheated apartment. She lost all her dark brown hair, only to see it slowly grow back in patches, lighter in color and as fine as a baby's. Well, you know. She'd taken to wearing a kerchief? A handkerchief. Or hat almost all the time. Her neck had become so spindly and fragile looking that she wrapped it in a scarf, avoiding glimpsing it in mirrors. A little more than a month ago, at the beginning of November, she had undergone another round of CAT-PET scans, and in December, she'd met again with Dr. Brodigan. The doctor had been more subdued than usual, although her eyes brimmed with compassion. There, she told Maggie that while more than 3 years of treatment had slowed the disease at times, its progression had never quite stopped. When Maggie asked what other treatment options were available, the doctor had gently turned her attention to the quality of life Maggie would have remaining. It was her way of telling Maggie she was going to die. Maggie had opened the gallery more than 9 years ago with another artist named Trinity, who used most of the space for his giant electric sculptures. Trinity's real name was Fred Marshburn, and they'd met at an opening for another artist show, the kind of event Maggie seldom attended. Trinity was already wildly successful at that point and had long toyed with the idea of opening his own gallery. He didn't, however, have any desire to actually manage the gallery, nor did he want to spend any time there. Because they hit it off, and because her photographs in no way compared with his work, they'd eventually make a deal. In exchange for her managing the business of the gallery, she would earn a modest salary and could also display a selection of her own work. At the time, it was more about prestige. She could tell people that she had her own gallery. Then, it was about the money that Trinity paid her. In the first year or two, she sold only a few prints of her own. Because Maggie was still traveling extensively at the time, more than 100 days a year on average, the actual day-to-day running of the gallery fell to a woman named Luann Summers. What was that? Sorry, I just got lost in the... Oh. Moldy Cheese with the raid. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Thank you. Welcome on in. I have not blinked a single time. Thank you very much. I hope you had a great stream, man. Thank you very much for the raid. Welcome on in. I really appreciate it. I'm kind of just reading with some background music, just taking it easy tonight. But welcome on in. Hello to the raiders and to Moldy Cheese. Thank you so much, man. I appreciate it. I really do. I hope you have a good morning, good night. Don't know what time it is, but hope you have a good one yourself. Thank you. Now, where was I? Oh, God. There I was. When Maggie hired her... here we go. When Maggie hired her, Luann was a wealthy divorcee with grown children. Her experience was limited to an amateur's passion for collecting and an expert's eye for finding bargains at the Neiman Marcus. On the plus side, she dressed well. She was responsible, concise, and willing to learn. And she had no qualms about the fact that she'd learned little to more than minimum wage. As she put it, her alimony was enough to allow her to retire in luxury. But there were only so many lunches a woman could do without going crazy. Luann turned out to be a natural at sales. In the beginning, Maggie had briefed her on the technical elements of all her prints, as well as the story behind each particular shot, which was often as interesting to the buyers as the image itself. Trinity sculptures, which utilize assorted materials, canvas, metal, plastic, glue, and paint, in addition to items collected from junkyards, deer antlers, pickle jars, and cans, were original to inspire spirited discussion. He was already established critical darling, and his pieces moved regularly despite their staggering prices. But the gallery didn't advertise or feature many guest artists, so the work itself was fairly low-key. There were days when only a handful of people entered the premises, and they were able to close the gallery at least 3 weeks of the year. It was, for Maggie, Trinity, and Luann, an arrangement that worked well for a long time. But two things happened to change all that. First, Maggie's cancer videos lured new people to the gallery. Not the usual seasoned contemporary art or photography enthusiasts, but tourists from places like Tennessee and Ohio, people who had begun to follow Maggie on Instagram and YouTube because they felt a connection to her. Some of them had become actual fans of her photography, but a lot of them simply wanted to meet her or buy one of her signed prints as a keepsake. The phone began to ring off the book with orders from random locations around the country, and additional orders poured in through the website. It was all Maggie and Luann could do to keep up, and the last year they made the decision to keep the gallery open throughout the holidays because the crowds kept coming. Then Maggie learned she'd soon have to begin chemotherapy, which meant she wouldn't be able to help at the gallery for months. It was clear that they needed to hire an additional employee, and when Maggie broached the subject with Trinity, he agreed on the spot. As fate would have it, the following day a young man named Mark Price walked into the gallery and asked to speak with her, an event that time struck her as almost too good to be true. Mark Price was a recent college graduate who could have passed for a high schooler. Maggie initially assumed he was another cancer groupie, but she was only partially correct. He admitted he'd become familiar with her work through her popular online presence. He was especially fond of her videos. He volunteered, but he'd also come in with a resume. He explained that he was looking for employment, and the idea of working in the art world strongly appealed to him. Art and photography, he added, allowed for the communication of new ideas, often in ways that words just didn't. Despite her misgivings about hiring a fan, Maggie sat down with him the same day, and it became clear that he'd done his homework. He knew a great deal about Trinity and his work. He mentioned a specific installation that was currently on display at the MoMA and another at the new school, drawing comparisons to some of Robert Rauschenberg's later work in a knowledgeable but unpretentious way. Though it didn't surprise her, he also had a deep and impressive familiarity with her own body of work, and yet, though he'd answer all her questions satisfactorily, she remained a little uneasy. She couldn't quite figure out whether he was serious about his desire to work in a gallery, or just another person who wanted to witness her own tragedy up close. As their meeting drew to a close, she told him that they weren't currently interviewing, though technically true, it was only a matter of time, to which he responded by asking politely whether she would nonetheless be willing to receive his resume. It was, she thought in retrospect, the way he'd phrased his request that charmed her. Would you nonetheless be willing to receive my resume? It struck her as old-fashioned and courtly, and she couldn't help smiling as she held out her hand in the document. Later that same week, Maggie had uploaded a job posting to some art-related industry sites and called several contacts at other galleries, letting them know that she was hiring. Resumes inquiries flooded the inbox, and Luann met with 6 candidates, while Maggie, either nausea or vomiting from her first infusion, recuperated at home. Only one candidate made it past the first interview, but when she didn't show up for the second, she was scratched as well. Frustrated, Luann visited Maggie at home to update her. Maggie didn't leave her apartment for days and was lying on the couch, sipping fruit and ice cream smoothie Leanne brought her with her. One of the few things Maggie could still force down. It's hard to believe we can't find anyone qualified to work in the gallery, Maggie shook her head. They have no experience and don't know anything about art, Luann huffled. Neither did you, Maggie could have pointed out, but she remained silent, fully aware that Luann had turned out to be a treasure as both a friend and an employee, the luckiest of breaks. Warm and unflappable, Luann had long ago ceased a mere colleague. I trust your judgment, Luann. We'll just start over. Are you sure there wasn't anyone else in the pool worth meeting? Luann's tone was plaintive. For whatever reason, Maggie's mind flashed to Mark Price, inquiring ever so politely whether she was willing to receive his resume. You're smiling, Luann said. No, I'm not. I know a smile when I see one. What were you thinking about just then? Maggie took another sip of her smoothie, buying time, until finally deciding to come out with it. A young man came in before we listed the position. She admitted before proceeding to describe the meeting. I'm still not sure about him, she concluded, but his resume is probably somewhere on my desk, in the office. She shrugged. I don't know if he's even available at this point. When Luann probed the origins of Mark's interest in the job, she frowned. Luann understood that the makeup of the gallery crowds better than anyone, and she recognized that people who'd seen Maggie's videos often viewed her as the confident, someone who would both empathize and sympathize. They frequently longed to share their own stories, the suffering they endured, and the losses. And as Maggie wanted to offer them comfort, it was often too much to support them emotionally when she felt like she was barely holding it together herself. Luann did her best to shield her from more aggressive contact seekers. Let me review his resume and I'll speak with him, she said. After that, we'll take it one step at a time. Luann contacted Mark the following week. Their first conversation led to 2 more formal interviews, including one with Trinity. When she later spoke with Maggie, her praise for Mark was effusive, but Maggie insisted on meeting with him again, just to be sure. It took 4 more days before she had the energy to make it to the gallery. Mark Price was on time, dressed in a suit and holding a slim binder he stepped into her office with. She felt sick as a dog as she studied his resume, noting that he was from Elkhart, Indiana, and when she saw his graduation date from the Northern Western, she did a quick mental calculation. You're 22 years old? Yes. With his neatly parted hair and blue eyes and baby face, he looked like a well-groomed teenager, ready for prom. And you majored in theology? I did, he said. Why theology? My father's a pastor, he said. Eventually, I wanted to get a master's in divinity as well, to follow in his footsteps. As soon as he said that, she realized it didn't surprise her in the slightest. Then why the interest in art if you're intended to go into the ministry? He brought his fingertips together, as though wanting to choose his words with care. I've always believed that art and faith have much in common. Both allow people to explore the subtlety and their emotions to find their own answers as to what the art represents to them. Your work and Trinity's always make me think, and more importantly, they make me feel in ways that often lead to a sense of wonder, just like faith. It was a good answer, but she nonetheless suspected that Mark was leaving something out. Setting those thoughts aside, Maggie continued with the interview, asking more standard questions about his work, history, and knowledge of photography and the contemporary sculpture before finally leaning back in her chair. Why do you think you'd be a good fit for the gallery? He seemed unfazed by her grilling. For starters, having met Miss Somers, I had the sense that she and I would work well together. With her permission, I spent some time in the gallery after our interview, and after a bit of additional research, I put together that some of my thoughts about the work currently on display. He leaned forward, offering her the binder. I've left a copy with Miss Somers as well. Maggie thumbed through the binder. Stopping at a random page, she perused a couple of paragraphs he'd written concerning a photograph she'd taken in Djibouti in 2011 when the country was mired in one of the worst droughts in decades. In the foreground were skeletal remains of a camel. In the background were three families dressed in brilliantly colorful garbs, all of whom laughing and smiling as they walked along a dried riverbed. Gathering storm clouds clouded a sky that had turned orange and red in the setting sun, a vivid contrast to the bleached bones of the skeleton and deep dissociation cracks that illustrated the lack of any recent rainfall. Mark's comments showed a surprisingly technical and sophistication and a mature appreciation for her artistic intentions. She'd been trying to show an improbable joy amid despair, to illustrate man's insignificance when faced with the capricious power of nature, and Mark had articulated those intentions well. She closed the binder, knowing there was no need to look any further. You were clearly prepared, and considering your age, you seem surprisingly well qualified. But those aren't my major concerns. I still want to know the real reason you want to work for us. His brow furrowed. I think your photographs are extraordinary, as are Trinity's sculptures. Is that all? I'm not sure what you mean. I'll be frank, Maggie said, exhaling. She was too tired and too sick, with too little time to be anything but frank. You brought in your resume before we even posted that we were hiring, and you admitted you're a fan of my videos. Those things concern me because sometimes people who've watched my videos about my illness feel a false sense of intimacy with me. I can't have someone like that working here. She raised her eyebrows. Are you imagining that we'll become friends and have deep and meaningful conversations? Because that's unlikely. I doubt I'll be spending much time at the gallery. I understand, he said, pleasant and unflustered. If I were you, I'd likely feel the same way. All I can do is assure you that my intention is to be an excellent employee. She didn't make her decision right away. Instead, she slept on it and conferred with Luann and Trinity the following day. Despite Maggie's continuing uncertainty, they wanted to take a chance on him, and Mark started at the beginning of May. Unfortunately, since then, Mark had given Maggie no reason to second-guess herself. With chemotherapy continuing to wipe her out all summer, she spent only a few hours a week at the gallery. But in the rare moments when she was there, Mark had been the consummate professional. He greeted her cheerfully, smiled easily, and always referred to her as Miss Dawes. He was never late for work, he never called in sick, and seldom disturbed her, knocking gently on her office door only when a bona fide buyer or collector had specifically asked for her and he deemed it important enough to intrude. Perhaps because he'd taken the interview to heart, he never referred to her in recent posts, nor did he ask her personal questions. Occasionally, he expressed the hope that she was feeling well, but that was okay with her, because he didn't actually inquire about it, leaving it up to her to say anything more if she wanted to. Moreover, and most importantly, he excelled at the job. He treated customers with courtesy and charm, moved the cancer groupies gracefully toward the exits, and excelled at sales, probably because he wasn't pushy in the slightest. He answered the phone, usually by the second or third ring, and carefully wrapped the prints before shipping those ordered by mail. Usually, to complete all his tasks, he would stay for an hour or more after the gallery had closed indoors. Luann was so impressed by him that she had no worries about her month-long holiday en Moai with her daughter and grandchildren in December, a trip she'd taken almost every year since she started at the gallery. None of that, Maggie realized, had been much of a surprise. What did surprise her was that in the last few months, Her reservations about Mark had slowly given way to a growing sense of trust. Maggie couldn't pinpoint exactly when that had happened. Like apartment neighbors regularly riding the same elevator, their cordial relationship settled into a comfortable familiarity. In September, once she began to feel better after her last infusion, she had started spending more time at work. Simple greetings with Mark gave way to a small talk before segueing into more personal subjects. Sometimes those conversations took place in a small break room down the hall from her office. Other times in the gallery when it was devoid of visitors. Mostly they occurred after doors had been locked, while the three of them processed and packaged the prints that had been ordered by phone through the website. Usually Luann dominated the conversation, chattering about her ex-husband's poor dating choices or her kids and grandkids. Maggie and Mark were content to listen. Luann was entertaining. Every now and then, one of them would roll their eyes at something Luann said. "I'm sure my ex is paying for all the plastic surgery on that tacky gold digger," and the other would smile slightly. Private communication meant for just the two of them. Sometimes, though, Luann had to leave immediately after closing. Mark and Maggie would work together alone, and little by little, Maggie came to learn quite a bit about Mark, even as he refrained from asking personal questions of her. He told her about his parents and his childhood, which often struck her as something akin to an upbringing imagined by Norman Rockwell, complete with bedtime stories, hockey and baseball games, and his parents' attendance at every school event he could remember. He also spoke frequently about his girlfriend, Abigail, who just started working towards a master's degree in economics at the University of Chicago. Like Mark, she'd grown up in a small town, in her case, Waterloo, Iowa, and he had countless photographs of the two of them on his iPhone. The photos showed a pretty young redhead with a sunny Midwestern effect, and Mark mentioned that he'd planned to propose to her after he received her degree, or after she received her degree. Maggie could remember laughing when he said it. "Why get married when you're still so young?" she asked. "Why not wait a few years?" "Because," Mark had answered, "she's the one with whom I'd like to spend the rest of my life with." "How can you know that?" "Sometimes you just know." The more she learned about him, the more she came to believe that his parents had been as lucky with him as he'd been with them. He was an exemplary young man, responsible and kind, disapproving the stereotype that millennials were lazy and entitled. Still, her growing fondness for them sometimes surprised her, if only because they shared so little in common. Her early life had been unusual, at least for a time, and her relationship with her parents had often been strained. She herself had been nothing like Mark. While he'd been studious and had graduated with the highest honors from a top university, she generally struggled with school and had finished less than 3 semesters at a community college. At his age, she'd been content in life in the moment and figure things out on the fly, whereas he seemed to have a plan for everything. Had she met him when she was younger, she suspected that she wouldn't have given him the time of day. When she'd been in her 20s, she'd had a habit of choosing exactly the wrong kinds of men. Nonetheless, he sometimes reminded her of someone she'd known long ago, someone who had once meant everything to her. By the time Thanksgiving rolled around, Maggie considered Mark a definite member of the gallery family. She wasn't as close to him as she was to either Luann or Trinity. They'd spent years together, after all, but he'd become something akin to a friend nonetheless. And 2 days after the holiday, all 4 of them had stayed late in the gallery after closing. It was a Saturday night, and because Luann planned to fly to Maui the following morning, while Trinity left for the Caribbean, they opened a bottle of wine to go with the cheese and fruit tray Luann had ordered. Maggie accepted a glass, even though she couldn't fathom the thought of either drinking or eating anything. They toasted the gallery, and it had been far and away their most successful year ever, and settled into easy conversation for another hour. Toward the end, Luann offered Maggie a card. "There's a gift inside," Luann said. "Open it after I'm gone." "I haven't had a chance to get yours yet." "That's fine," Luann said. "Seeing you back to your old self these past few months have been more than enough than a gift for me. Just make sure you open it well before Christmas, though." After Maggie assured her that she would, Luann stepped toward the platter and grabbed a couple of strawberries. A few feet away, Trini was speaking to Mark. Because he visited the gallery even less frequently than Maggie did, she heard Trinity asking the same kinds of personal questions that she had over the last few months. "I didn't know you played hockey," Trinity offered. I'm a huge Islanders fan, and even if they haven't won the Stanley Cup, it seems like forever. It's a great sport. I played every year until I got to Northwestern. Don't they have a team? I wasn't good enough to play at the collegiate level, Mark admitted. Not that it seemed to matter to my parents. I don't think either of them ever missed a game. Will they come out to see you for Christmas? No, Mark said. My dad set up a tour of the Holy Land with a couple of dozen members of the church for holidays. Nazareth, Bethlehem, the whole works. And you didn't want to go? It's their dream, not mine. Besides, I have to be here. Maggie saw Trinity glance in her direction before he turned his attention back to Mark. He leaned in, whispering something, and though Maggie couldn't hear him, she knew exactly what Trinity had said, because he expressed his own concerns to her a few minutes earlier. Make sure you keep an eye on Maggie while Luann and I are gone. We're both a little worried about her. In response, Mark simply nodded. Trinity was more prescient than he probably realized, but then again, both Trinity and Luann had known Maggie had another appointment with the Dr. Bradigan scheduled on December 10th. And sure enough, at the appointment, Dr. Bradigan had urged Maggie to focus on her quality of life. Now it was December 18th. More than a week had passed since that awful day. Maggie still felt almost numb, nor that she told anyone about her prognosis. Her parents had always believed that if they prayed hard enough, God would somehow heal her, and telling them the truth would take more energy than she could summon. Same thing in a different way with her sister. Long story short, she didn't have the energy. Mark had texted a couple of times to check in on her, but saying anything about her situation via text struck her as absurd, and she hadn't really been ready to face anyone. As for Luann and even Trinity, she supposed she could call them, but what would be the point? Luann discovered to enjoy the time she was spending with her own family without worrying about Maggie, and Trinity had his own life as well. Besides, there was nothing that neither of them could really do. Instead, dazed by her new reality, she'd spent more time on the last 8 days either in her apartment or on a short, slow walk through the neighborhood. Sometimes she simply stared out the window, absently fondling the small pendant on necklace she always wore. Other times, she found herself people-watching. When she'd first moved to New York, she'd been very enthralled by the ceaseless activity around her. By seeing people rushing down into the subway or peering up into the office towers at midnight with the knowledge that people were still at their desks. Following the hectic movements of pedestrians below her window brought back memories of her early adulthood in the city and the younger, healthier woman she'd once been. It seemed like a lifetime had passed since then. It also felt as though the years had passed in the blink of an eye, and her inability to grasp the contradiction made her more self-reflective than usual. Time, she thought, would always be elusive. She hadn't expected the miraculous. Deep down, she'd always known a cure was out of the question. But wouldn't it have been great to learn that the chemotherapy had slowed the cancer a little, or had bought her extra year or two, or that some experimental treatment had become available? Would that have been too much to ask? To have been given one last intermission before the final act began? That was the thing about battling cancer. The waiting. So much of the last few years had been waiting. Waiting for the appointment with the doctor, waiting for the treatment, waiting to feel better after the treatment, waiting to see whether the treatment had worked, waiting until she was well enough to try something new, until her diagnosis. She viewed waiting for anything as an irritation. But waiting had slowly but surely become the definition of reality to her life. Even now, she suddenly thought, here I am, waiting to die. On the sidewalk, beyond the glass, she saw people bundled up in winter gear, their breath making clouds of steam as they hurried to an unknown destination. On the street, a long line of cars with glowing taillights crawled through the narrow lines by pretty brick townhouses. There were people going about their daily lives, as though nothing out of the ordinary were happening. But nothing felt ordinary now, and she doubted things would ever feel ordinary again. She advised them. These strangers she would never meet. They were living their lives without counting the days they had left. Something she would never do again. And as always, there were so many of them. She'd grown used to the fact that everything in the city was always crowded, no matter the time or the season, which added inconvenience to even the simplest of things. If she needed ibuprofen from Duane Reade, there was a line to the checkout. If she was in the mood to see a movie, there was a line at the box office too. When it came time to cross the street, she was inevitably surrounded by other people, rushing and jostling at the curb. But why the rush? She wondered about that now, just as she wondered about so many things. Like everyone, she had regrets, and now that the time was running out, she couldn't help dwelling on them. There were actions she'd taken that she'd wished she could undo. There were opportunities she missed and now would never have the time to do. She'd spoken honestly about some of her regrets in one of her videos, admitting to feeling unreconciled to them, and no closer to answers than when she'd initially been diagnosed. Nor had she cried since her last meeting with Dr. Brannigan. Instead, when she wasn't staring out the window or taking her walks, she focused on the mundane. She slept and slept, averaging 14 hours a night, and had ordered Christmas gifts online. She'd recorded but hadn't yet posted another cancer video concerning her last appointment with Dr. Brannigan. She'd smoothies delivered and tried to finish them as she sat in the living room. Recently, she even tried to have a lunch at Union Square Cafe. It had always been one of her favorite places to grab a delicious meal at the bar, but the visit ended up being a waste. Since everything that crossed her lips still tasted wrong, cancer taking yet another joy from her life. Now it was a week until Christmas, and with the afternoon sun beginning to wane, she felt the need to get out of the apartment. She dressed in multiple layers, assuming she would stroll aimlessly for a bit, but once she stepped outside, the mood to simply wander passed as quickly as it had come. Instead, she stared toward the gallery. Though she wouldn't do much work, it would be comforting to know all was in order. The gallery was several blocks away, and she moved slowly, trying to avoid anyone who might bump into her. The wind was icy, and by the time she pushed through the doors of the gallery half hour before closing, she was shivering. It was unusually crowded. She expected the holidays would diminish the number of visitors, but clearly she'd been wrong about that. Luckily, Mark seemed to have things under control. As always, when she entered, heads turned in her direction and she noticed dawning looks of recognition on some faces. Sorry, not today, folks, she suddenly thought, offering a quick wave before hurrying to her office. She shut the door behind her. Inside, there was a desk and an office chair, and one of the walls featured built-in bookcases piled high with photographs, books, and keepsakes from her far-flung travels. Across from the desk was a small gray love seat, just big enough to curl up if she needed to lie down. In the corner stood an ornate, carved rocker with flowered cushions that Luann had brought from her country house, lending a touch of warmth to the modern office. After piling her gloves, hat, and jacket on the desk, Maggie readjusted her kerchief and collapsed into the office chair. Turning on the computer, she automatically checked the weekly sales figures, noting the spike in volume, but realized she wasn't in the mood to study the numbers in detail. Instead, she opened another folder and began clicking through her favorite photos, finally pausing at a series of images she'd taken in Ulaanbaatar, Mongolia last January. At the time, she had no idea it would be the last international trip she would ever take. The temperature had been well below zero the entire time she was there, with biting winds that could freeze exposed skin in less than a minute. It had been an effort to keep her camera working because the components grew finicky in temperatures that low. She could remember repeatedly tucking the camera inside her jacket to warm it against her body, but the photographs were so important to her. She braved the elements for almost 2 hours. She wanted to find ways to document poisonous levels of air pollution and its visible effects on the population. In a city of 1.5 million people, nearly every home and business burned coal throughout the winter, darkening the sky even the brightest of days. It was a health crisis as well as an environmental one, and she wanted her images to spur people to action. She logged countless photographs of children covered in grime as a result of stepping outside to play. She'd caught an amazing black and white image of a filthy cloth that had been used as a drapery for an open window, dramatizing what was happening inside otherwise healthy lungs. She'd also sought out a stark paranoia of the city and finally nailed the images she wanted. A brilliant blue sky suddenly, immediately gave way to a pale, almost sickly haze, as though God himself had drawn a perfectly straight line, dividing the sky in two. The effect was utterly arresting, especially after the hours she'd spent refining it in post. As she stared at the image and solace of her office, she knew she would never be able to do something like that again. She would likely never travel for work again. She might not even leave Manhattan unless she gave in to her parents and returned to Seattle. Nor had anything in Mongolia changed. In addition to the photo essay that she contributed to The New Yorker, a number of media outlets, including Scientific America and The Atlantic, had also tried to raise awareness regarding the danger levels of the pollution in Ulaanbaatar. But the air, if anything, had grown even worse in the last 11 months. It was, she thought, yet another failure in her life, just like her battle with cancer. The thoughts shouldn't have been connected, but in the instant they were. And all at once, she felt tears begin to form. She was dying. She was actually dying. And it dawned on her suddenly that she was about to experience her very last Christmas. What should she be doing with the last precious weeks? And what did quality of life even mean when it came to the actuality of day-to-day living? She was already sleeping more than ever, but did quality mean getting more sleep to feel better, or less sleep so the days seem longer? And what about her routines? Should she bother making an appointment to have her teeth cleaned? Should she pay off the minimum balance on her credit cards or go on a spending spree? Because what did it matter? What did anything really matter? 100 random thoughts and questions overran her. Lost in all of it, she felt herself choke before letting go completely. She didn't know how long the outburst lasted. Time slipped away. When she was finally spent, she stood and wiped at her tears. Glancing through the one-way window above her desk, she noticed that the gallery floor was empty and the front door had been locked. Strangely, she didn't see Mark. Even though the lights were on, she wondered where he was until she heard a knock at the door. Even his knock was gentle. She considered making an excuse until the evidence of her breakdown subsided, but why bother? She long since stopped caring about her appearance. She knew she looked awful even at the best of times. "Come on in," she said, pulling Kleenex from the box on her desk. She blew her nose as Mark stepped through the door. "Hey," he said, his voice quiet. "Hi. Bad time?" "It's alright." "I thought you might like this," he said, holding out a to-go cup. "It's a banana and strawberry smoothie with vanilla ice cream. Maybe it'll help." She recognized the label on the cup. The eatery was 2 doors down from the gallery and wondered how he'd known how she was feeling. Perhaps he divined something when she'd make a beeline for the office, or maybe he'd simply remembered that the Trinity told him. "Thank you," she said, taking it. "Are you okay?" "I've been better." She took a sip, thankful it was sweet enough to override her messed up taste buds. "How was it today?" "Busy, but not as bad as last Friday. We sold 8 prints, including a number of 3 rush. Each of her photographs was limited to 25 numbered prints. The lower the number, the higher the price. The photo Mark mentioned had been taken at rush hour in Tokyo subway. The platform jammed with thousands of men dressed in what seemed to be identical black suits. Anything by Trinity? Not today, but I think there's a good possibility of that in the near future. Jackie Bernstein came in with a consultant earlier. Maggie nodded. Jackie had bought 2 other Trinity pieces in the past, and the Trinity would be pleased to know that she was interested in another. How about the one on the website and phone-ins? 6 confirmed. 2 people wanted more information. It shouldn't take long to get the sales ready for shipment. If you want to head on home, I can handle it. As soon as he said it, her mind floated additional questions. Do I truly want to go home? To an otherwise empty apartment? To wallow in solitude? No, I'll stay, she demurred, shaking her head for a while anyway. She sensed his curiosity, but knew he wouldn't ask more. Again, she understood the interviews had left a lingering mark. I'm sure you've been following my social posts and videos, she began, so you probably have a general sense of what's going on with my illness. Not really. I haven't watched any of your videos since I began working here. She hadn't expected that. Even Luann watched the videos. Why not? I assumed you'd prefer that I didn't. And when I considered your initial concerns about my working here, it seemed like the right thing to do. But you didn't know I underwent chemotherapy, right? Luann mentioned it, but I didn't know the details. And of course, in rare times you were at the gallery, you looked... When he trailed off, she finished for him, like death. I was going to say you looked a bit tired. Sure I did. If Gwent Green shrinking and balding could be explained by waking up too early. But she knew he was trying to be kind. Do you have a few minutes before you start getting the shipments ready? Of course. I don't have anything planned for tonight. On an impulse, she moved to the rocker, motioning for him to get comfortable in the love seat. Not going out with friends? It's kind of expensive, he said, and going out usually means drinking, but I don't drink. Ever? No. Wow, she said. I don't think I've ever met a 22-year-old who's never had a drink. Actually, I'm 23 now. You had a birthday? It wasn't a big deal. Probably not, she thought. Did Luann know? She didn't say anything to me. I didn't mention it to her. She leaned forward and raised her cup. Happy belated birthday, then. Thank you. Did you do anything for fun? For your birthday, I mean? Abigail flew out for the weekend and we saw Hamilton. Have you seen it? A while ago. But I won't ever see it again. She didn't bother to add, which was another reason not to be alone. So the thoughts like that didn't precipitate yet another breakdown. With Mark here, it was somehow easier to keep herself together. I'd never seen a show on Broadway before, Mark went on. The music was amazing and I loved the historical element and the dancing and everything about it. Abigail was electrified. She swore she'd never experienced anything like it. How is Abigail? She's doing well. Her break just started, so she's probably on her way to Waterloo right now to see her family. She didn't want to come out here to see you? It's sort of a mini family reunion. Unlike me, she has a big family. 5 older brothers and sisters who all live in the country. Christmas is the only time they all get together. And you didn't want to go out there? I'm working. She understands that. Besides, she's coming out here on the 28th. We'll spend some time together. Watch the ball drop on New Year's Eve and things like that. Will I get to meet her? If you'd like. If you need time off, let me know. I'm sure I can manage on my own the next couple days. She wasn't sure she could, but it felt like she needed to offer. I'll let you know. Maggie took another sip of her smoothie. I don't know if I've mentioned it lately, but you're doing really well here. I enjoy it, he said. He waited and she knew again that he made a choice not to ask personal questions, which meant she would have to volunteer the information or keep it to herself. I met with my oncologist? Why does that sound so weird? Last week. She stated in what she hoped was an even voice. She thinks another round of chemotherapy will do more harm than good. His expression softened. Can I ask what that means? It means no more treatment and the clock is ticking. Well, I gotta change the song. Hold on. Sure. He paled, registering what she hadn't said. Oh, Miss Dawes, that's terrible. I'm so sorry. I don't know what to say. Is there anything I can do? Okay, that was not the song I needed. I don't think there's anything you can do, but please call me Maggie. I think you've worked here long enough for the two of us to use first names. Is the doctor certain? The scans weren't good, she said. Lots of spread everywhere. Stomach, pancreas, kidneys, lungs. And though you won't ask, I have less than 6 months. Most likely it's somewhere around 3 to 4, maybe even less. Surprising her, his eyes began to well with tears. Oh, Lord, he said, his expression suddenly softening. Would you mind if I pray for you? Not now, but when I get home, I mean. She couldn't help smiling. Of course he would pray for her. Future pastors that he was. She suspected he'd never uttered a profanity in his life. He was, she thought, a very sweet kid. Well, technically he was a young man, but I'd like that. For a few seconds, neither of them said anything. Then, with a soft shake of his head, he pressed his lips together. It isn't fair, he said. When is life ever fair? Can I ask you how you're doing? I hope you forgive me if I'm overstepping. It's okay, she said. I guess I've been in a bit of a daze since I found out. it has to feel unbreathable or unbearable. At times it does, but then other times it doesn't. The strange thing is that physically I feel better than I did earlier in the year, during the chemo. Back then, there were times when I was sure dying would be easier, but now, she let her gaze wander over the shelves, noting the trinkets she collected, each one imbued memories of trips she'd taken, to Greece, Egypt, Rwanda, and Nova Scotia, to Patagonia, and Easter Island, Vietnam, and Ivory Coast. So many places and so many adventures. It's a strange thing to know the end is so imminent, she admitted. It gives rise to a lot of questions. Makes a person wonder if what it's all about. Sometimes I feel like I've led a charmed life, but then in the next instant I find myself obsessing over the things I missed out on. Like what? Marriage, for starters, she said. You know, I've never been married, right? When he nodded, she went on. Growing up, I couldn't imagine that I'd still be single at my age. It just wasn't the way I was raised. My parents were very traditional, and I assumed I'd end up like them. She felt her thoughts drifting to the past, memories bubbling to the surface. Of course, I didn't make it easy for them. Not like you, anyway. I wasn't always a perfect child, he protested. I got in trouble. For what? Anything serious? Was it because you didn't clean your room or because you were a minute late for your curfew? Oh wait, you were never late for your curfew, right? He opened his mouth, but when no words came out, she knew she was right. He must have been the kind of teenager who made things harder for the rest of his generation, simply because he was wired to be easy. The point is, I've been wondering how things would have turned out if I had chosen a different path. Not just marriage, though. What if I worked harder in school, or graduated from college, or had a job in an office, or moved to Miami or Los Angeles instead of New York? Things like that. You obviously didn't need college. Your career as a photographer has been remarkable, and your videos and posts about your illness have inspired a lot of people. That's very kind of you, but they don't really know me. And in the end, isn't that the most important thing in life? To be truly known and loved by someone you've chosen? Maybe, he conceded, but that doesn't negate what you've given people through your experience. It's a powerful act, even life-changing for some. Perhaps it was his sincerity or his old-fashioned mannerisms, but she was struck again by how much he reminded her of someone she'd once known long ago. She hadn't thought about Bryce in years. Not consciously anyway. For most of her adult life, she tried to keep her memories of him at a safe distance. But there was no reason to do that any longer. Would you mind if I asked you a personal question? She said, mirroring his curiously formal style of speech. Not at all. When did you first know that you were in love with Abigail? As soon as she said Abigail's name, a tenderness came over him. Last year, he said, leaning back into the cushions of the love seat. Not long after I graduated. We'd gone out 4 or 5 times, and she wanted me to meet her parents. Anyway, we were driving to Waterloo, just the two of us. We stopped for something to eat, and on the way out, she decided she wanted an ice cream cone. It was scorching outside, and unfortunately the air conditioning in the car wasn't working that well. So, of course, it started to melt all over her. A lot of people might have been upset by that, but she just started giggling like it was the funniest thing ever as she tried to eat it faster than it could melt. Or faster than it could melt. There was ice cream everywhere. On her nose, fingers, in her lap, and even in her hair. And I remember thinking I wanted to be around someone just like that forever. Someone who could laugh at the inconveniences of life and find joy in any occasion. That's when I knew she was the one. Did you tell her then? Oh no, I wasn't brave enough. It took me until last fall before I could finally work up the courage to tell her. Did she say that she loved you too? She did, and that was a relief. She sounds like a wonderful person. She is, and I'm very lucky. Though he smiled, she knew he was still troubled. I wish there was something I could do for you, he said, his voice soft. Working here is enough. Well, that and staying late. I'm glad to be here. I wonder though. Go ahead, she said, gesturing with a smoothie. You can ask whatever questions you'd like. I've got nothing to hide anymore. Why didn't you ever get married? If you thought you would, I mean. There was a lot of reasons. When I was just starting out in my career, I wanted to concentrate on that until I established a foothold. Then I started traveling a lot, and then the gallery, and I just got too busy. And you never met someone who made you question all that? In the silence that followed, she unconsciously reached for the necklace, feeling for the small shell-shaped pendant, making sure it was still there. I thought I did. I know I loved him, but the timing wasn't right. Because of work? No, she said. It happened long before then. But I'm pretty sure I wouldn't have been good for him. Not back then, anyway. I can't believe that. You don't know who I used to be. She put down her cup and folded her hands in her lap. You want to hear the story? I'd be honored. Kinda long, though. It's kinda long. Those are usually the best kind of stories. Maggie bent her head, feeling the images bent to surface at the edge of her mind. With the images, the words would eventually come, she knew. In 1995, when I was 16 years old, I began to lead a secret life, she started. And that is a long chapter. Oh my, I haven't read like that much, and it was so long, dude. I just got lost in everything. Oh, how's everybody doing? My God, I forgot I was streaming. Jesus. Oh, how's it going, Jude? How you doing? What's up? There's an ad. Doesn't matter. I don't care. This is a good book. You should hydrate and blink. I haven't blinked once yet. I'm not even kidding. My throat is killing me, but this story is so good. I just wanted to read. That's honestly it. I just wanted to read. But I will drink. I will. So it's about an hour a chapter, I think. Oh, man. That's like... Wow, that's like an eighth of the book already. Just about. Holy smokes. Oh. Hope everyone is doing well. Hope you guys are doing great. How is it going tonight? Just kind of reading. Ooh, I gotta blink. My eyes are falling asleep in my eyelids. Oh. Such a good book already. It's crazy though, because it's going through a story of where like she's struggling to find meaning in life, the quality of life, dealing with such a bad stage of cancer, knowing that she's not going to make it, but she's sharing her story anyways, and this becomes like the real story, the real meat of the book. Oh, excuse me. How you doing, Mojo? How's it going, man? I hope you're doing better tonight. Hope the little one's okay, getting better at least. Kixie, welcome. Get up and move. You're right. It'll probably help, yeah. It's too early for snow. It's Halloween in 2 weeks. No, it's like freezing temperatures right now. Snow's coming, Jude. It's coming for you. Oh.